Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my August wrap-up. August was a roller coaster of a reading month. It was one of those months where I didn't know what I was gonna read until I started reading it. There was even one point like mid-month where I thought I was gonna completely go off the rails, but I think I actually stayed pretty faithful to my original plans, surprisingly. We have a lot to talk about, so let's just get into it. So we're gonna start off with The Spirit Bares Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White. I read this as an arc from Peachtree Teen, and by the time you see this video, this book will have recently come out on September 5th. This is a queer historical horror story set in London during the 1880s, and we're following an autistic closeted trans boy named Silas. Silas has grown up in this underground community of people who can commune with spirits, who are known as speakers and mediums. Because it is the 1880s, there's this belief that those who are assigned female at birth are not good enough to become speakers and mediums themselves, and therefore their only use is to be married off and to procreate so that they might pass on those traits. Unfortunately, because Silas is closeted and seen socially as a woman, he's been prescribed that very fate himself, and is to be married off by the end of the year. But when he makes a desperate attempt to escape that marriage, he's diagnosed with a fabricated condition known as veil sickness and forcibly sent to a sanatorium for aggressive treatment. Treatment that may very well kill him if he can't escape first. Also, as I said, Silas is autistic and a trans boy, and his love interest Daphne is actually a trans girl, so there's an underlying T for T romance. Content warnings for transphobia, ableism, graphic violence, medical gore, discussions of forced pregnancy and miscarriage, sexual assault, mentions of suicide ideation, allusions to animal death, some mentions of food restriction, and some descriptions of vomit. Now that I've read 2 books from Andrew, I can confidently say that his fiction is always going to perfectly walk that line between gruesomeness and profound catharsis. I think both this book and Hell Followed With Us are deeply, deeply horrific in very different ways, but also very effective ways. Like I said in my anticipated releases video, if Hell Followed With Us is Andrew's trans rage book, then The Spirit Bares Its Teeth is his disabled trans rage book, and it is great. This grisly manifesto railing against systemic ableism is so incredibly needed, and it makes all too much sense that Silas's struggle against those ideologies is a violent one. This story is definitely not for the faint of heart, but I love it for that. And I think one way that the story keeps you immersed in the morbid atmosphere and grounded in this horrific sense of urgency is in the use of language. Silas is an aspiring surgeon. He studied Victorian medicine and surgical procedures from his older brother, so he sees the world through that lens, often likening things that he observes to medical practices, which are all extremely crude and violent during this time period. So that continuity of language is extremely effective. It gives us a strong insight into how Silas's mind works, and thematically it's powerful because it echoes the story's thesis statement. To me, that metaphor of crude medical practices and Silas's obsession with them represents the idea that even though the process itself may be gruesome or seemingly impossible to endure, healing and recovery and having a better chance of life are possible, even considering the significant risk and cost. And I think it makes all the sense in the world that Silas wants to not only be on the other end of that as someone who's been forcibly repressed and denied his entire life, but to be the one who's in control of those processes, especially when so many medical professionals, even today, abuse that kind of power. But most importantly, there's incredible nuance on display in this story, specifically in the way it distinguishes between the act of seeking validation and becoming the arbiter of your own validation. On the surface, it might seem like this story is about Silas wanting to prove himself as a man, as a surgeon, as a disabled person with autonomy, and on some level he is. But the truth of the matter is that he is all of those things from the very first page, and it's just the world that fails to see it. So in all actuality, it's not about Silas seeking these pathways towards legibility or legitimacy, but rather realizing that he is the only one who can decide who he is. Silas is not broken. He doesn't need to be changed. He doesn't need to be fixed. It's the world that needs to catch up to where he already is. I don't know if I'm doing this book justice, but I loved it. It's disturbing, it's gross, it's unsettling, but it's incredibly powerful and undeniable in its purpose. I could not tear my eyes away from it every time I picked it up. I do think the world building is a little bit hazy at times, but that's a very small note. I definitely recommend this, and I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, a spur-of-the-moment library hold came through, and that was for 100 Boyfriends by Brontez Purnell. I would not describe this as a short story collection, which implies that each story is self-contained and unrelated to whatever comes before or after, but rather it's exploring an overarching theme or conceit through chapters that read as short stories. This is a transgressive, sort of tongue-in-cheek exploration of deeply imperfect queer Black men who are desperately fighting and often giving into the urge to self-sabotage. These are queer men who recreationally abuse drugs, engage in sex work, are sexually promiscuous, who date married men and older men, who live in abandoned warehouses, who will happily risk anything for satisfaction, survival, or affection in a world that offers them none of those things. I do want to directly quote this line from the synopsis, which says, "Armed with a deadpan wit, Purnell finds humor in even the darkest of nadirs with the peerless zeal, insight, and horniness of a gay punk messiah." Content warnings for references to drug and alcohol abuse, some descriptions of sex work, mentions of death and grief, brief imagery relating to suicide and self-harm, some use of racial and homophobic slurs, some references to bullying and sexual assault, some ableist language, references to infidelity and partner violence, and explicit sexual content. This is such a short little book, but not a single word is misplaced. Not one fraction of space is misused. It's doing so much in such a condensed space, and it kind of blew my mind. I deeply respect the way these stories are purposefully centering experiences and expressions of queerness that often only exist in the periphery of our collective consciousness, in the furthest margins of society, and bringing them a sense of dignity, a sense of gravity, in a way that they're not afforded nearly enough. And what I found myself thinking about the most as I read through these stories was the concept of placelessness, which in very specific context is an experience that is uniquely singular to queer folks of color. This concept of getting lost between these two clearly defined or stratified spaces, not clearly belonging to one thing or the other, but falling into this undefined, unknown, invisible in-between space. The characters and their experiences in this story feel largely transitory. Nothing is permanent, nothing is stable, nothing is sure. They're just passing through and leaving their mark on as many people as possible, hoping that it makes them legible or real in some way. It's very much exploring the concept of sexuality or hypersexuality as a means of legibility, leaning into sexuality as a means to legitimize and express queerness, especially because of its ability to be quantified or even gamified, which I think is a huge unspoken part of cis gay culture in a lot of ways. It's also about transactional relationships, exchanging one thing for another as a means of gaining validation, safety, resources, satisfaction, or affection. And it's fascinating to see how those transactional interactions play a role in the formation of identity, in the ways that our identities come to the fore based on our proximity and sometimes even the value we have to other people. Even though this felt a little bit disjointed at times, it was still incredible. If I had my own copy, it would have annotations on pretty much every single page. This book is thoughtful, it's funny, it's smart, it makes no apologies and pulls no punches, it's radical in every way a story can possibly be radical, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then my library came through with another audiobook hold, and that was For Some Desperate Glory by Emily Tesh, read by Senna Breyer. This is a queer sci-fi space opera following Keir, who's been raised her entire life on a space station called Gaia Station after the destruction of Earth and most of humanity at the hands of an alien race. Gaia Station is a very militant space station. Everyone's prescribed very specific roles and ranks, and children are heavily trained in combat basically from birth, and Keir just so happens to be one of the best warriors of her generation. So Keir's incredibly faithful to this system. She takes her training very seriously. She longs for the day she'll be drafted into this intergalactic war, which is her sole purpose in life. But when Command assigns her brother to certain death and relegates her to the nursery to bear their sons, she knows there's been a huge mistake, and that she must take humanity's revenge into her own hands. Content warnings for blood, graphic injury, and graphic violence, experienced homophobia and bullying, allusions to rape and forced pregnancy, and some mentions of suicide. Before I actually talk about the book, I do want to mention that the audiobook is read by a trans woman, not because there's a trans character, but just because her narration kicks ass. And I just wanted to say, yes, more of this please, because trans creatives deserve all of the opportunities, not just the trans ones. Also, most of the characters in this story are queer, and I found Keir to be very heavily aro ace coded as well. I'll start by saying that this was not a new favorite book for me. I was hoping it would be, but it wasn't, and that's okay. But it was still a super fun, exciting, thrilling, action-packed sci-fi story that I did very much enjoy. This is gonna sound silly and a little little bit reductive, and it kind of is, but this book is almost like A Christmas Carol meets military sci-fi in space. It's playing with that concept of a morally grounded time loop story in really interesting ways. I won't say much more about that, but I will say that this story does have a few of my favorite things. A character realizing that the world they've always known is a lie, ragtag family inciting rebellion, and unfeeling main character reluctantly and begrudgingly discovers emotions, all of which endeared me to this story very much. I think where the story stands out most, where it absolutely gets full marks, is in the extraordinary character growth that Kira experiences. When the story starts, she is unquestioningly faithful to Gaia Station. She follows the rules religiously. She's high on her own self-importance. She doesn't care about being liked because she's convinced she's going to leave everyone behind in her dust. She believes that everyone ends up where they're supposed to be and that everything about the way this system works is true and righteous. So obviously, as someone who's literally a warrior-class human, her world completely shifts on its axis when she's assigned to nursery duty, and that leads her to uncovering all kinds of world-shattering secrets that deeply change how she sees, understands, and carries herself. That, for me, is the most gratifying part of this story by far, seeing how this radical shift in perspective not only changes Kira's goals, but makes her question the role she's played in that corrupt system and what she can do to change her impact going forward. And I think that strongly relates to the thematic work this story is doing, especially in how it's exploring the fact that perspective changes everything. How horrific things are only horrific until we have control over them. How we willingly consent to terrible things as long as those things benefit us. How the gatekeepers of history and information can dictate the creation of the future in whatever way they so choose. So in some ways, this is a classic underdog rebellion story that's incredibly exciting and satisfying to read. For me, where it fell short was in the world building and the pacing. It takes a very long time to get to the inciting action, and I think the story takes a little bit too long to introduce these alien races and forms of alien technology that play a major part in the story. So it kind of fumbled the bag for me in that way. I also think that while Kira is an incredibly distinctive, bold, complex, fully realized character, I found the other characters and relationship dynamics to be a little bit lacking. But this was still a good time, I would still recommend it, and I gave it 3.5 stars. Then I read another arc that has recently been released, and that was Wolf, Willow, Witch by Faithless Moon, which came out on September 4th. This is the second book in the Gideon Testaments trilogy, which is a trilogy of queer horror romance novellas, the first being Heart Haunt Havoc. This installment is about necromancy, thievery, and Norse magic. It's about Teller Nilsson, who's a self-described Viking witch and always looking for a chance to strengthen her power or find new sources of power, which is why she can't resist the lure of ritualistic magic when she discovers an abandoned corpse emanating sinister energy hidden in her friend's empty house. But raising this corpse from the dead is proving to be much more difficult than she thought, since he actually has a very strong grasp of demonology himself, which results in a power struggle between the two sides. Then a mysterious neo-church arrives in town, and Taylor catches wind of a legendary relic that might just shift the tide if she and her warden spirit can somehow work together to infiltrate this congregation's ranks. Content warnings for some body horror, animal mutilation, depictions of mania, murder, discussions of sexual abuse, premeditated abuse, and religious abuse, some depictions of blood, ritualistic bloodletting, gore, and violence, descriptions of drowning, and explicit sexual content. In typical Freydis fashion, this was a wild ride from start to finish. It did take me a second to get into the story, I won't lie, because it's basically predicated on Teller undoing a pretty significant plot point from the first book, and it took me a while to stop questioning why she would do that. In fairness, the story is very clearly described as a villain romance right on the tin, which is to say it's a romance between two objectively bad people who move through the world without remorse and don't operate from a place of morality or logic or sense or anything that isn't their affinity for destruction or their own obsessive self-interest. So once I got past that and realized, okay, this isn't about doing the thing that makes sense, but rather hungering for power no matter what the cost is, then everything clicked. As usual, I really appreciate the way Freydis uses religious imagery and themes as a way to excavate catharsis that comes from freeing oneself of religious oppression or abuse. In this case, the story is in part about Taylor and Lincoln trying to infiltrate this culty New Age church, and it's really satisfying to see them sort of play the system and use these churchgoers and religious gatherings to their own nefarious ends. There's also a really cool element of the story where Taylor and Lincoln are physically connected to each other through magic, and that was an interesting element that really added to the romantic dynamic between the two characters. I think that adds to the underlying tension of their relationship. They both know they have power over the other person. They know they have a say in what happens to the other person, what they feel. And while they do occasionally misuse that power, it also sort of forces them to settle into this begrudging trust. But I think the bigger picture of the story is about sitting in discomfort and uncertainty. In the character's own words, it's about holding grief and ambition at the same time, mourning what you've been through, what you've lost, the versions of yourself that no longer exist, while also wanting more for yourself. I think it's about stepping into your power without remorse, without compromising or negotiating what that power might mean for other people, without worrying about how other people might resent you for taking your chance. The world often teaches us that we shouldn't be selfish, which is a good rule of thumb in most cases. But sometimes when it comes to the things that matter, the things that we have to fight for, the things that will never be handed to us, it pays to be a little bit selfish. So yes, this is a dark, messed up, sexy, tropey paranormal romance. It does feel like a middle book in the sense that while it has a conclusion and a very clear arc, you can tell that its purpose is really setting up the finale. And admittedly, I can't wait to see how everything comes to a head. But overall, I enjoyed this and I gave it 4 stars. Then even though I did technically have this book as an e-arc, I listened to the entire audiobook on the release day, and that was Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher, which came out on August 15th from Tor Books. This is another classic Kingfisher fantasy novella showcasing her trademark blend of fairy tale and dark fantasy as we follow Toadling, a toad-shaped fairy who was taken from her human family as a child and raised by fairies. Now in her adulthood, she's been tasked with returning to the human world and bestowing a magical blessing on a newborn child. But instead of a blessing, she accidentally bestows a curse. From there, the story seems to take the familiar shape of a sleeping maiden locked away in a tower surrounded by thorny brambles. But in this story, awakening the monstrous princess from her slumber might just be the kiss of death for everyone and everything as they know it. Content warnings for death, violence, blood, and medical trauma relating to childbirth, some non-graphic references to animal torture, and mentions of suicide. As I said, this is what T. Kingfisher does best. She thrives in this dark, borderline horror fantasy space, but is always able to bring some levity and humor into it, and Thornhedge really sits right in that sweet spot. I love Kingfisher's ability to reimagine classic fairy tale stories or tropes and flip them on their heads. The cleverness of the sleeping maiden being the villain of the story is extremely compelling, and on the flip side of that, I also adore Kingfisher's ability to endear the reader to incredibly unlikely characters. Toadling would be a completely unremarkable character in any other story. She's not secretly beautiful, she's not heroic, she's not confident, she doesn't even have especially powerful fairy magic. And the other main character, Halim, is a knight, but he's not a Christian knight as is traditional, he's a Muslim knight. And he's also not especially storied or heroic. So to have these two unsure, hesitant, terrified characters be the driving force behind this story is a huge part of what makes it so charming, and it makes the story that much more satisfying to read as they really try to screw their courage to the sticking place. Thematically, the story resonated with me as well because both characters are struggling against these self-imposed moral strictures that are completely of their own creation, which traps both of them in different ways. Toadling feels at fault for what's happening with this sleeping maiden, and she's taken it upon herself to stand watch over this tower and make sure no one ever enters, which means her life has effectively shrunken down to this one endless task, this one very small point. And Halim feels incredibly bound to this code of knighthood, this call to help the helpless no matter what. And even though Toadling is warning him that this tower is dangerous, there's a part of himself that still demands he see it for himself, despite the warnings and his own good sense. So I feel like those parallel conflicts are really exploring the ways in which we hold ourselves prisoner, with our guilt, with our sense of obligation, with our regret or fear of regret, to the point where we don't allow ourselves to grow or to live. I think it's about how sometimes we try our best, maybe we put in more effort than we can even afford to, and we still fail. And that's okay, that's part of life. Overall, I found this to be a delightful way to spend an afternoon. The story is original and captivating and presents some really compelling characters while also delivering on those dark fantasy elements. The story doesn't overstay its welcome either. It's exactly as long and as detailed as it needs to be, which is definitely a plus. That said, Kingfisher has set a pretty high bar for herself across the board, so on the spectrum of all things Kingfisher, even though I think this is certainly on the higher end, I don't think it's quite at the caliber of the best I've seen from her so far. So for me, this was a solid 4 4 stars. After that, I got another audiobook hold from my library that wasn't supposed to come through quite yet, but since it did, I decided to pick up Ebony Gate by Julia V and Ken Babel, another book I had as an e-arc that came out on July 11th from Tor Books, and the audiobook is read by Natalie Naudis. This is the first book in a new Japanese-inspired urban fantasy trilogy. It was pitched as like a female John Wick with dragon magic, and the story follows Emiko, who belongs to a very powerful magic family, but she herself doesn't have a magical talent and instead made her name as the family's blade. After conducting a traumatic massacre, she gave up that title and walked away from the family business to take up a quiet life of dealing imported antiques in San Francisco's Chinatown. But then a Shinigami, a death god, calls in a family blood debt that Emiko is sworn to answer, and he tells her that the Ebony Gate, an artifact that guards a portal to the spirit world that prevents hungry ghosts from terrorizing humans, has gone missing. And if she can't find it, he will use her soul as the anchor instead, and her life will be forfeit. Content warnings for mentions of suicide, some magic-related bloodletting, graphic injury and violence, instances of bullying and physical assault, some depictions of vomit, explorations of parental and familial estrangement, and some use of ableist language. The most tepid, level-headed thing I can say about this book is that it's fine. It's fine. I don't regret the time I spent with it. I admit I was a bit disappointed by it, but at face value, this is a solid urban fantasy story with plenty of action and intrigue to at least carry the plot to fruition and keep the reader engaged throughout. But putting that aside, I do appreciate how the story is both action-driven and also driven by interpersonal dynamics. It's about Emiko struggling to separate herself from her family and these clan politics, but then landing right back in the middle of them without really having a choice. So that really supplies this tension between her desperately trying to be herself and live by her own standards while also being sucked back into this conflict that she wants no part of, still being forced to take part in this cyclical violence. I do have a lot of respect for the story's thematic work in that sense. I think there's a level of catharsis watching Emiko go through this journey, really trying to resist the powers that be, and in the end exercise her free will to make her own decision about how she wants to live her life. The other main thing I enjoyed about the story is that it's action-packed and fast-paced. There's a very clear ticking time bomb the story has to adhere to, which definitely brings a sense of urgency that constantly keeps the story moving from one thing to the next. I don't want to say too much about it, but there's also some very cool like City We Became type vibes that I also enjoyed very much. All that said, for me, I think this really boils down to cool idea, not so great execution. The world building was severely lacking for me. Not only did the majority of it come from these huge info dumpy sections, but it almost felt like we needed a prequel to fully understand the context of this world. There's a lot of really important things that happen before this story begins that play a significant role in how the characters have been shaped that we as the readers never get to understand in context. And yes, maybe those flashbacks will come in later books, but for me, that's not good enough. Staving off that character building until later in the trilogy feels too little too late. If I'm not invested in the characters in book 1, I'm not even gonna read those later books. And going back to that ticking time bomb construct, while I really appreciate the urgency and tension that infuses into the story, for some reason it also made the pacing of the book so strange. I think Emiko's given maybe 48 hours to accomplish her task, but it felt like she did way more than 48 hours worth of things, and only some of those things were actually related to tracking down the gate. She did all these weird little side quests that kind of took me out of the story because I was like, babe, you do not have time for this. You don't even have a working lead right now. So oddly enough, even though there's a very clear time restraint in the story, it causes time to sort of expand and balloon in ways that don't make sense. I don't have much more I want to say about this. It was a cool story. I don't regret reading it by any means, but ultimately I was not invested in the characters or in what might come next after this. So I gave this 3 stars, which admittedly might be a little generous. Then my Patreon pick for August was Beating Heart Baby by Leo Min. Not to self-promote too much, but if you support me on Patreon at any tier over $1, not only do you get to see all of my videos early, but you can also vote on a poll each month to choose one book I will definitely read and review, which is what I'm about to do. So Beating Heart Baby is a queer contemporary YA romance and coming-of-age story. We begin by following Santi, a mixed-race Filipino teenager who's been raised pretty much his entire life by his late mom's best friend, and has a very complicated complicated, kind of checkered past. Because he's been a bit of a troublemaker and actually has to repeat a grade, his guardian decides they're going to move to Los Angeles so Santi can have a fresh start and also join her marching band alma mater, which she believes is going to help him in terms of structure and discipline. Everyone in band is super welcoming to Santi except for this haughty trans trumpet player named Suwa, who clashes with Santi almost immediately and declares that he's not good enough to be in this music program. But of course, the more these two get to know each other, they realize that they both come from difficult circumstances and have much more in common than they initially thought. And just as they start falling for each other, their budding relationship is put to the test with Suwa's ambitions to become this incredible indie rock artist. Like I said, Santi is a mixed-race Filipino boy. I'm not sure if he's also Latina or if he's just absorbed some of his guardian's Mexican culture, but Suwa is also mixed-race, Japanese and Korean, and he is a trans boy who wears a binder and is doing HRT. Content warnings for disownment and family estrangement, parental death and grief, some underage drinking and drug use, mentions of depression and suicidality, depictions of panic attacks, experienced homophobia, transphobia, and forced outing, some dead naming and misgendering, references to child abuse, and some fade to black sexual content. Holy shit. This book is a gut punch in the best way possible. It's been a little bit since a story made me feel so alive and so aware of how incredible it is to be alive in quite the way this story does. There's an element of hazy nostalgia that permeates every inch of this story, and it just hit me in all the right ways. In his official blurb, Adib Khorram wrote, "You know that feeling when you hear your favorite song for the first time? Liu Min has captured it in electrifying prose." And I think he really got to the heart of it there, because that's really what reading this book feels like. It feels like discovering something that you know you're going to carry with you for years and years and years to come. There's such a tenderness to this story that I don't know how Liu Min was able to capture. It feels fragile, it feels delicate, but also radiating this strong, pulsating heartbeat, no pun intended, at the center in a way that's undeniable. This is a beautiful love story. It's a beautiful coming of age story. It's about these two boys who are not broken, but who have had to endure much more than others just to find some semblance of love and safety and stability and authenticity to call their own, who have really struggled to feel wanted. Despite their complex familial backgrounds, or perhaps because of them, they do know what it feels like to receive love. And there's really beautiful elements of found family as well. But they still struggle with not only expressing love to others, but also showing love and care to themselves. I also love how the story is structured. It's very slice of life in the sense that there is overarching conflict. You do have an idea of where the story is going, but the first half especially is just about relishing in these extraordinarily everyday moments that these characters are going to remember for the rest of their lives. The first part is about those foundational memories, those foundational friendships, those foundational moments that shape everything that comes afterwards. And then the second half of the story is not only switching perspectives, but also seeing the characters into the beginning of their adulthood and seeing how they still carry those things with them. There's a lot in this story about echoes, about feedback loops, about recursive or cyclical choices that always come back around. It really explores the dissonance between feeling like you've come so far and changed so much, only to feel like you're right back where you started. So I feel like that's the big question this story is grappling with. How can you honor the past? How can you mourn what you've lost or what you could have had while still moving forward? How can the past spur you towards the future instead of keeping you from it? I genuinely don't have the words to describe what Liu Min has accomplished in this book. This incredible story really makes you feel the entire spectrum of human emotion in the best way possible. If you want a story that makes you feel something, like really feel something, then you have to read this. It's a little bit nitpicky of me, and I know that, and I hate myself for it, but I do have to say I wanted a little bit more from the marching band part, selfishly, but more importantly from the conflict in the second half. It's resolved a little bit too easily, I think. I think there was more to explore there for sure. For that reason alone, I technically gave this 4.5 stars, but make no mistake, in my heart, it's 5 stars. Now, because of scheduling stuff, I am filming this a little bit early, so I may very well finish something else before the month is over. If I do, I will try my best to review that on some other platform or figure out something else. That said, if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, feel free to let me know what you think down below in the comments. But that's everything I had to share for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.